Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to session 2 of Disruption, Action, and Change, creating a more just and equitable arts ecosystem. My name is Samantha Williams, and I am a graduate student earning my specialist degree in voice performance at the University of Michigan. I am also the research fellow for the Excel Lab. I am excited to welcome today's guests, Joelle Thompson, composer, and Garrett McQueen, the founder of Trilloquy, with whom we'll discuss the theme of making and spreading art that advocates for change. Thank you so much for joining us. Disruption, Action, and Change is presented by the Excel Lab at the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and the Eastman School of Music's Paul R. Judy Center for Innovation and Research. I'm joining you today from Baltimore, Maryland, and I would like to acknowledge the territory on which I reside as the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people. This acknowledgement reminds us of the complex and layered nature of place, community, and belonging in this virtual series. It encourages us to recognize, include, and respect the many peoples and traditions that make up our artistic ecosystems. To learn more about the Indigenous communities in your area, please visit native-land.ca. So a few points of order as we get ready to begin. Welcome to Disruption, Action, and Change. If you have questions during this discussion, please type them into the Q&A box at any point. We'll address all questions in the last 30 minutes in our Q&A section. The first hour will be a moderated discussion between myself and our panelists. Please complete our very brief feedback poll at the end of this session. A window will pop up on your screen. It will take 30 seconds or less, and it gives us a lot of helpful information on who you all are. And lastly, the session will be recorded for later viewing by registrants only. Our next and final Disruption, Action, and Change session will be the next Thursday, March 25th at 4:30 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And you can find more information at the link in the chat. Additionally, our guests today have included beautiful blogs that you can also find at a link in the chat that go more into depth on some of the things we'll discuss today. Again, I'd like to welcome today's guest, Joelle Thompson. Joelle, if you'd like to give everyone a wave. Joelle is an Atlanta-based composer, conductor, and educator, best known for the choral work 7 Last Words of the Unarmed, which won the 2018 American Prize for Choral Composition. He is currently a doctoral student at the Yale School of Music. Thompson was also a 2017 post-grad fellow in Arizona State University's Projecting All Voices Initiative, and a composition fellow at the 2017 Aspen Music Festival and School. His opera, The Snowy Day, based on the book by Ezra Jack Keats, will premiere December 2021 at the Houston Grand Opera. Congratulations, Joelle. Garrett McQueen is a bassoonist, radio host, and producer of the Trilloquy podcast. He's been the host and producer behind nationally syndicated public media content at the intersection of race, contemporary culture, and classical music. Garrett also works as a member of the leadership teams of the American Composers Forum, the International Society for Black Musicians, and the Black Opera Alliance. Thank you both so much for joining us today. How are you all doing?
Hanging in there.
Doing well. Thank you for having us.
It is such a pleasure to have you both here. I have had so much fun getting to know you all a bit beforehand and getting to do my research on all of the amazing work you both have contributed. I'd love to begin just by asking you both how you relate to the term disruptor and what it is that you see yourself disrupting. Whoever would like to go first, it's all you.
I'll actually start. And before I answer that question, I wanted to make sure that I honored the lives of those lost down in Atlanta. Over the generations, America's original sin of anti-Blackness has grown into a problem that impacts all people of color. The struggle continues, and I hope that we all people can figure out how to take an active stance against white supremacy together. I just wanted to make sure that I named that and honored those lost. Concerning disruption, about a year ago, the Star Tribune here in the Twin Cities printed an article on me with the big headline of classical agitator, and that's how I sort of coined that term. So not specifically disruptor, but agitator. From my perspective and in my work, programming decisions that I made on national radio and otherwise contribute to that agitation. I relate to that idea of disruption or agitation as agitating the systems that maintain the racism that so-called classical classical music needs to survive. When we talk about decentering whiteness, we have to talk about a complete transformation of what we even call classical music. So in my work, I aspire to plant a seed in the minds of as many people as possible, just to get everyone to really think about what we mean when we use that phrase. What are the problems therein? I want to disrupt everything that maintains the status quo of classical music here in America, and that's how I relate that idea to me and my work.
What a powerful response. Thank you, Garrett.
Well, it's hard to follow that. But I too would like to acknowledge the tragedy in my hometown of Atlanta. A lot of my friends are in mourning, and I join in solidarity with them. It's a very familiar place for me and for us, and it's disheartening to see that this has become commonplace for people of color in this country. But I don't think any of us are surprised, and I don't know, have to guard my heart against cynicism, otherwise I'll just slip into despair. But regarding your question about disruption, though, in my blog post, I mentioned a little bit about how concerning it is that I feel that my own identity, just simply existing, is disruptive in this space. And that's an indictment on the space that I am occupying. That if simply existing feels like disruption, then what am I doing here? Is the follow-up question. But also thinking of disrupting, I think of something that is in flow, like a stream or a river or some sort of moving body. And if simply existing becomes a dam in the river that is classical music, or the system or the institutions that, you know, comprise the genre of classical music, then I understand that the molecules that make up this flow are white supremacy, because that's the only thing that I could be stopping. And so, like Garrett was saying, we have to examine the genre itself. Is it possible to save the genre from the white supremacy that sustains it? How do we transform after we disrupt? Is sort of the questions that come when I think about disruption in this context.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for sharing. I think that both of you got so beautifully in your blog posts about the tradition of classical music and what it means to just be yourself, to choose not to code switch, and what it means to be a Black artist in this space. I know that Garrett, you specifically talked about this conditioning that's present in classical music. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that and tell us how you would like to redefine classical music.
Yeah, so the first music that I knew was Black music, music that has been affirmed over the generations, from contemporary greats like Beyonce, decades past like Nina Simone, all the way back to the late 19th century when Antonin Dvorak was affirming Black music as the foundation of American classical music. So, you know, that's the first point that I want to make. My introduction to music was classical music. It's just not classical music as defined by the current infrastructures. So the way in which we're introduced to the world of orchestral music, playing instruments and otherwise, is more times than not through that white lens. When we center Europe in our study of music, in our study of singing, our study of learning how to play an instrument, we're conditioned to believe that it's more worthy of study. Okay, so when you codify that racist practice with the phrase classical music, you create these giant systems and these giant agents of unchange, which is why we're here today. They don't call it classical training for nothing. I think that's a very important point to make. So when I speak about conditioning, that's what I'm talking about. When we learn to play an instrument, we aren't learning music that comes from our culture, music that we already know. We're learning, you know, some European folk song called Hop Cross Buns or Hey Diddle Diddle or whatever. So from the very beginning, you know, we're conditioned to see white music as something A, that's classical, and B, something that is more worthy of the study and more worthy of the practice. So when I talk about breaking down these structures, I'm talking about getting back to that Black music that actually serves as the foundation of American culture and what I believe should be America's classical music.
That was beautifully said. It makes me thinking of it less as redefining classical music and more as reclaiming the term classical music, right? Broadening what we define as classical. I think that just reminds me so much of all of those experiences that I'm sure many Black kids have growing up, where you talk to your friends about like music from the 80s or music from the 90s, and you realize you're talking about two completely different sets of music. And, I just remember having to learn Springsteen and learn these people when I grew up, knowing, James Brown and et cetera, and having how you have to learn both sets, and what that means. So thank you so much for that. Joelle, in your blog post, you describe yourself as a composer in dialogue with the legacy of Western European music. I thought that was so beautifully written. Could you please tell us more about what you mean by that?
Well, I think I'm in dialogue with Western European concert music the same way that Sonic Silk, the Anderson Paak and Bruno Mars new joint is in dialogue with 70s soul. They're making music right now, but they couldn't. They're playing with an aesthetic and sonic textures that are reminiscent of Teddy Pendergrass or Earth, Wind and Fire, or so like if I'm writing a string quartet, I can't escape the legacy of Haydn. That's what I mean by in dialogue with. But I'm in dialogue with it, but I'm attempting to state my truth, and my truth is rooted in a love of classical music as we understand it, as we are trained to understand it, as Garrett has pointed out, but also a love of Black music as well, the music that I grew up listening to, that is also part of the Caribbean diaspora and also American, African American music. And so if my love of that music makes who I am, I'm going to bring all of the rhythms, all of the intentionality, all of the textures that comprise my being into this space. And, as we all know, there is resistance to that. But I'm still in dialogue. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as you talk about being in dialogue, do you also resonate with what Garrett was saying about this idea of being conditioned into this classical music education? I mean, you're still in school, so I'm interested in what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I'm in, a doctoral program, and it's designed for me when I leave to have almost an encyclopedic knowledge of the Western canon. And I have to be able to hold my own in front of a committee of established professional musicians who know the canon like the back of their hand, and be able to dialogue with them in a substantial way. It is disheartening that the music that I know more intimately, the music that makes up my soul, is not going to be, I'm not going to be assessed on that. And I would like for Dvorak's words to be taken seriously, that he thought that the future of American classical music would be rooted in Negro melodies, as he called them, and then the melodies of the Native Americans. And yet I am being required to memorize the opus numbers and dates of Austro-German composers in America centuries later. And so I think, what Garrett said definitely resonated with me for sure.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that my next question is, so when there's all of this kind of tension in your identity and in the art form that you are choosing to be in, why have you both chosen to spend your energy attempting to change, how many people view the definition of classical music, instead of moving to a genre that might be seen as more inclusive or more amenable?
I approach this question in a similar way that I approach the question of, well, if America is so racist, why don't you just go and move somewhere else? Well, the fact of the matter is that we built this country. This country belongs to Black people more than anyone else, with the explicit and exclusive exception of Indigenous people. So the question is not where we need to go. I turn it back around and say where you need to go. Okay, so as that applies to your question, to classical music, we're talking about something that belongs to us anyway. We created America's classical music, and white people not understanding that does not change that truth. You know, classical music, as it were, is not a space that we are trying to infiltrate. Classical music in the United States is a space that has been claimed by a tradition that is not our own, by a European tradition. So it's not about us, you know, trying to infiltrate the space. It's about understanding that truth, which is a means of understanding why those other so-called amenable genres exist. They exist because of the active active exclusion that's codified so-called classical music in the United States so long ago as nothing more than a copy of European structures. So when it comes to why I fight, because it belongs to us.
Yeah, I mean, he said it all. But for me, I do see that. I mean, I also ask the question, why not? You know, why not struggle to make this a more equitable space? I it's this problem exists outside of the genre of classical music. I mean, Tyler, the creator, was given, I think he won a rap Grammy on an album where it's pretty much mostly singing, or like, you know, he's bending genres, and he complained last year about um, being put in a category based on his skin color rather than his music. And yeah, that's the mechanism of white supremacy that we're struggling with as artists and much more as human beings. So here is a space um, that contains a music that I love being in dialogue with, that I love creating. Why not make it a space in which I can be myself? Why should I be put into a you know, it's a horrible metaphor, but a cage? Why should I be put in a separate box? That's, I mean, one can look at the history of American music and its evolution as some sort of Hegelian dialectic between Black people making some sort of innovation and it being co-opted or stolen or appropriated, and then continually growing back and forth between the oppressor and the oppressed. We're constantly put in a box, and then we find a way to burst out of it. So why accept the box? Why not, you know, change it? But Garrett said it way more eloquently than I.
I will add this, Joel. You mentioned Tyler the Creator. You know that album Igor. Tyler the Creator was the last concert that I went to before everything shut down, so it still rattles around in my head. And for fans, you know, if I'm into vinyl, I play a lot of vinyl. If you buy the vinyl version of Igor, there's a track that is exclusive to the vinyl that features Charlie Wilson. And if Charlie Wilson is not one of America's classical composers, classical artists, I don't know who is.
Well, that's perfect, because I was just about to ask if you could both name a few artists who you would want to be included in the classical canon who you don't think currently are.
Nina
The
Simone.
Who did you say? Oh, Nina Simone. Yeah, Nina Simone. The person that pops into my mind immediately is Stevie Wonder. If he did not
Oof.
compose American classical music, who did? I mean, we can talk about uh I mean, there's all of these soul artists. You know, there's somebody who sang "Let's Stay Together," Al Green. You know, we
Mhm.
can talk about Al Green and all of these people. Aretha Franklin. You know, Queen Latifah. You know, who is classic, who is foundational to hip hop, but her. You know, again, it's a Beyonce. Obviously, it's a reframing of the way we think about what is classical music from the lens from the context of America, again understanding the Negro spiritual and indigenous music as what is foundational to everything we're listening to and performing today in the United States.
Yeah, I think the spiritual is our early music. I feel like that is, just as we are studying the ornamentations, the goat trills, and all of that of European early music, our schools of music should be training singers in America how to engage with foundation, like there've been articles in the New York Times about how the foundation of our contemporary, Black music, American music, period, is rooted in the spiritual. From spiritual to slate song to blues to jazz. I mean, to soul to yeah. So I would like all of that to be considered classical music.
And then, of course, when you talk about teaching those traditions, we have to talk about who is in the room. We need Black people in the spaces who are already experts on this classical music. Think about the experiences that happen across the country every Sunday. Well, before COVID, every Sunday morning, the performances that take place all across the country. The experts are there. The experts in the field are there. We have to get them into the institutions if that's something that we're interested in passing on to the next generation as our classical music, and as I think we should be.
But it's also interesting that just having people in these structures doesn't necessarily change things. If I mean, the fact that the majority of teachers in this country are women, why hasn't that dismantled the patriarchy? You can have Black teachers, but will still be used to uphold the existing systems. So it's more than just including the talent and bringing that in. It's really transforming the structures that are upholding the system as it currently stands.
See, what you're hitting on, as quiet as it's kept, more times than not, it requires a compliance with the system to get to those positions. You know, and that's the conversation that we don't want to have oftentimes.
Right.
We applaud the single Black person or the single woman in this infrastructure. We need to understand the why behind that singularity. Why is there only one? Because the space itself is not conducive to being oneself in those
Mhm.
spaces unless you make certain sacrifices. Not to say that all Black people who have ascended to certain positions of power are code switching or anything, but 100% of them have certainly made sacrifices. I definitely feel comfortable saying that.
That gets back to your earlier comment about the conditioning of classical music, right? But if you get to the point where you would know enough about classical music to know the right people to be advocating for this change, you've been in it for long enough that you're no longer, in many cases, associating these other genres with it. It's kind of the way the system works. So no, 100%. Which also leads to the question of, if we're talking about change, how much of the onus for this change do we think is on the music itself or is on the institutions? Joelle, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as a composer and a student who's kind of in the midst of both right now.
Yeah, can you ask the question one more time?
Yeah, of course. So how much of the onus for this change is on the music itself or is on the institutions?
So as an artist, I don't want to dictate what another artist should or should not do. I think that's every artist's prerogative. For me though, I can't help but be intentional about how I am, enacting my artistry, how I am making music. There are higher stakes, I suppose, as a Black person in this space. But I think right now we're in a culture in which, as evidenced by lots of Facebook posts yesterday, in which we value music over people, rather than people over music. And in order to actually flip that fraction, to flip that equation, we need, it's a systemic thing. We need a systemic solution, and systemic solutions are always radical. And so we do need, I think the onus is on all of us, frankly. But in order for anything to change, the institution needs to transform itself. People make up an institution, yes, but we all have encountered the brick wall that is trying to change an institution, trying to change a culture embedded within an institution. So I do what I can to try and be an ethical artist. I do think that we are on the cusp, if not in the middle of an ethical renaissance of ethical artistry, where we are moving towards, we are moving towards valuing people over music, but having our music be a representation of how much we value people. I feel that artists are going to be the ones who are going to further bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice. I've seen my peers do it. I mean, Garrett's doing it. We're all aiming to transform this thing that we love so much to be something that's more equitable and leading towards a more just future. So yeah, I don't have anything else.
Yeah, I want to echo something that Joel pointed to, concerning the rapist that died this week. What we're talking about is how that conditioning that I was speaking to earlier conditions us to value people if their proximity to this art that we have been conditioned to believe is above all. Any conversation surrounding art versus artist, certainly in that context, I think is a gross misunderstanding of the role of art and how so-called classical music continues over the generation. He was not the only person to conduct those pieces, but because of that proximity and because of our conditioning, there are certain things that we will overlook. So that's just one of the many examples of how that conditioning ends up being way more harmful than not. Music itself can and does uphold systems. Obviously there's power in messaging and music, but I think the institutions serve as the vehicle and as the context for that music. Schools maintaining their curriculums. Joel, I'm so glad that Joel named the Negro spiritual, Negro melodies, as Dvorak called them, as our early music. When we're talking about early music, that is what we should be looking at, and that is not a slight to Akagam and all of those people, but we should be looking at what is early music for us, and the institutions aren't yet creating that context for it. Let's move on to the orchestras. Orchestras refusing to decenter their mostly white audiences is orchestras refusing to be active in working against a white supremacy. That goes far beyond music. And even, and I thought of this example when I read this question, when we're talking about the institutions as context, I will never forget the first day that I heard Joel's 7 Last Words of the Unarmed. It was a live performance, and before that performance, the presenters wanted to honor and thank the policemen that were in the crowd. Even the institutions that are giving radical pieces of music like that the stage are operating under that white supremacy that requires them to tip their hats to the overseer, as I see it. So yes, music is very, very, very much an important part of the conversation, but I think it's the institutions that are the vehicles and the context for it, and that is what we have to really center in on.
Thank you so much. And I think that line is exactly what it's all about. And so for both of you, as you're working on how to create change, what have your approaches been? How are you able to commit to doing this work of creating a more inclusive canon and creating more intentionally diverse standards while working within these institutions? Garrett, if you maybe want to start in terms of your work.
Yeah, sure. My how. So, I consider it a privilege. And through that privilege comes responsibility. I'm grateful to be able to make a way for myself to survive and to serve as an example of the courage it takes to really dismantle these systems. Classical music, as we know it, is racist, period. Classical music is racist. And that is a sentence that so many people do not yet have the courage to say. Classical music is racist. That's really scary for people. So what I see as my role in presenting content and presenting myself as someone who can say those things, who has the privilege to not be under the thumb of certain institutions to name certain truths. A renewed look at classical music as it should be, requires an acceptance and a centering of a completely different aesthetic and a completely different way of approaching the performance experience. What we hear, how we orally define classical music and other genres. Here in America, I believe that that should be defined by BIPOC music, specifically Black music, and the music codified by Indigenous people. Broadcast and digital media is my instrument in seeing that through. The bassoon was my first instrument. I think the microphone was my ultimate instrument.
I absolutely love that imagery. Absolutely. Thank you for that, Garrett. Joelle, what about yourself? How have you been thinking about the how and how we create change?
Well, as a composer, I mean, just like Garrett's first instrument was the bassoon, my first instrument was really voice and piano, and in a Black church. And in that environment, I got to experience what it's like to have music shape community and community shape music. And that sort of cycle is what I'm hoping can be, replicated in this new and transformed version of American classical music. And so if that's my goal, to sort of create a space in which we can see each other in the context of music, because I do think that music has the power to allow us to see each other. I have to be intentional about that. I think, Garrett referenced my 7 Last Words of the Unarmed. I feel the reason that piece, I have so many complicated feelings about it, but it was way more vulnerable than let me just rephrase that. If I had known that it would be played and listened to by a bunch of audiences, it would be a different piece. I did not expect, especially white people, the typical classical music audience, to engage with that work. But I was able to be myself, and I've seen what the piece has been able to do with the advocacy and support of people like Garrett, who have been sharing the piece with audiences around the country. I've seen that honesty and vulnerability, when presented in the right context, yields a sort of a reciprocation of that. And in that space, we are allowed to see each other. And we all understand on a fundamental level as musicians the power of music to transform. And because that's why we are musicians, we have been transformed by music, and we want to contribute to this transformation for those who engage with our art. And so I'm being intentional to utilize that power in service of, reshaping the context in which we, reshaping classical music, reshaping society through this art form. It sounds really idealistic, but I think that's where we have to start as musicians. We have to be rooted in hope, otherwise nothing gets done. So that's my goal right now, to keep making those spaces available through my music.
Joel, I want to name and honor everything that you've had to have been going through in this past year, with everyone seeing that specific piece of music all of a sudden. So a phrase that I use all the time is pimping out the pain. Black people are so used to selling our anguish,
Mhm.
and I think this is a prime example of the issues we're dealing with in so-called classical music. There are countless people who can connect the name Joel Thompson to the piece 7 Last Words of the Unarmed. I wonder how many of those people can connect your name to another one of your pieces of music.
Right. There is definitely a commodification of Black trauma that exists in classical music. And I mean, I was just telling some composer friends yesterday that, if you look at the operatic canon, it basically survives on narratives of violence against women. And if that has sustained centuries of operatic art, I hesitate to venture, like, if all the inclusion initiatives are successful and more Black people are present, will we be relegated to pimping out the pain, as you say? Will we be relegated to this specific, narrow view of Black humanity, always existing within a white racial frame, always rooted in trauma, in our past and present? That's why it's been healing for me to work on Snowy Day, because it's just about a Black boy in the snow doing nothing. It's just, it's mundane. It's just existing. And I didn't realize how healing it would be to work on that until I actually did. And now I'm thinking about, how can I center Black humanity without the white racial frame, without rooting it in trauma? How can the Afrofuturist aesthetic is now appealing to me. I'm thinking about that a lot, to imagine a future. That's why I think Black Panther was so successful, because it really allows one to say, like, who am I without the white racial frame? Like, can I just simply exist? And while the answer is no right now, can we imagine a future that is possible? So yeah, I'm hoping that, music will allow me the space to dream about that.
You mentioned Black Panther. Early this morning, I got up to finish binging. I had to watch the last 2 episodes of WandaVision.
Oh yeah.
I was catching up. My entrance into the entire Marvel universe was Black Panther. I tell people that all the time. The first time I saw a Marvel movie was Black Panther. Went to the theaters for it and all. So that introduced me and opened me up to this whole Marvel universe of content. It's the same thing with this so-called classical music. What the institutions don't yet understand is that if you put more, I think at least the same amount, hopefully more energy into centering the people and the aesthetics and the stories that you have not always, it's also beneficial to you. People act like that, it's a risky thing, but it's not. Megan Thee Stallion with the Houston Symphony, you could not get into that building. Nas with the New York Philharmonic, Jay-Z with the New York Philharmonic, couldn't get into that building. Let's even talk about a video came out with Tank and the Bangers and the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra. I don't know if y'all saw that. Under normal circumstances, outside of COVID, that would have been a packed house. We aren't seeing the examples we already have of how this sort of work is beneficial to all people and not just people of color.
That's why I'm really excited for the Esperanza Spalding Wayne Shorter opera. I don't know if you heard about that.
I have.
Yeah. Independently produced and everything without, yeah. I'm excited.
Yeah.
Okay, so Garrett, when you say these things and you talk about these incredible examples, which I am already so excited about, I can't wait to go look into this Esperanza Spalding opera. But when you say statements like, classical music is racist, and this is a statement that, I am in a position where I can make, do you worry about trying to make this in a way that is, palatable, to a largely white and wealthy audience? How much time or energy do you spend in, thinking about the way you're phrasing this and sharing this?
Mm-hmm. When I read this question, I immediately thought of Kasia Brooks, or KJ Brooks, from Kansas City. If you don't know who she is, she went viral for her speech against the Kansas City Police Department. And she began, one of her opening sentences was, "Y'all can't and won't be my oppressor and my savior." I hold that dear. I hold that deep to my chest. And I honor her for saying that, because it is so true. The answer to your question, I do not center white people in my work. Asking me to consider the white people is asking me to consider one of the many catalysts in the problems we're facing, okay? The people that I do consider in my work are my white allies and my white accomplices. But to ask me to consider the audiences that have maintained this status quo is not in the direction that change is leading. If those audiences were agents of change, things would be changed, because the orchestra is not new. Orchestral performance in the United States is not new, okay? What is new is centering audiences that see a problem there, and the institutions aren't really doing that yet. But as far as I'm concerned, no, I don't consider those audiences because I don't consider them a part of the solution. I consider them a part of the problem. And I understand how that can be jarring to a lot of white people. What I found in my work is that the more honest and the more genuine I am, the better chances that I have of finding my allies and finding my accomplices. You know, I do a lot of work with my podcast, Trilloquy, sort of being at the center of it. Most of my team is white. Why is that? Why can I trust them with that content and in that space? Because I carry myself genuinely and they know how I get down and they know how I see moving toward the future. It's as simple as that. I spent a lot of time thinking about this question because there are so many of us who just, you know, again, don't have the courage or don't have the privilege in being able to speak that truth. And I've really do my best to use the word privilege because there are a lot of, you know, most Black people are working in white companies or white-led infrastructures where it is unsafe for them to name certain things. And I acknowledge that. I am not in a position like that, so it's my responsibility to say what the rest of us can't.
I think for me, my parents were teachers. My dad was a physics professor, and my mom taught middle school for a million years. And I think that teaching education is a core component of my artistry. I'm missing it a lot now that, I mean, I get to TA, but it's not the same as like running my own class as I did before starting my doctoral studies. And so with from my education lens and perspective, it's I have to think about my lesson plan, think about what I'm trying to communicate to students who are willing to learn. And it's very tricky because the curriculum is don't kill me. The curriculum is value my humanity. There, you know, I'm using a sort of student teacher paradigm, but the power that's contained in this metaphor is the reverse. The people who hold the money, the people who I'm trying to educate to value me and my humanity in this context, and in this society, it's, you know, it's almost silly to use that metaphor, but in the end, I can't take away that lens of education of, you know, I guess maybe my privilege is having that spirit and being able to, you know, sometimes healthily, sometimes not, deal with the baggage that comes with educating people for my own survival. I think we have privileges from different perspectives, Garrett and I, but I think our goal is the same in that we in order for us to not just survive but thrive, things need to change. And I guess we have our different mechanisms, different ways of going about it. But you know, I'm in the end, all I can say is that I'm going to be using my instrument just as Garrett is using the microphone. I'm hoping to use composition to facilitate change.
You know, you touched on it just a little bit. I don't think we have time for it today, but I think as the conversation of race in America continues to evolve, we're going to have to get closer and closer and closer to the conversation of capitalism. Why do we have to practice respectability politics? What does it mean to survive in the United States? What does it mean to thrive? And what are the mechanisms that make that possible and keep that from happening? The more we dig into racism, I think we'll see at the core of it all is a need to really dismantle capitalism. When we think about slavery, you know, what was that but a gross injustice rooted in capitalism? We're getting closer and closer and closer to that conversation, but we need more of us to understand and be able to traverse the conversation of race before we can even get there.
And maybe kind of in this vein, talking about this line between capitalism and racism and the ways in which we need to think about white audiences. Joelle, specifically when you were talking about how if you had realized that the 7 last words of the unarmed would be used in the context that was, you might have written a different piece or that you would have written a different piece. I wonder how that factors into this idea of when you're writing, how much you think about the white audience watching what you're writing versus being authentic to your experience or writing for a Black audience, and how you kind of balance those two, particularly if, you know, I think about the events of this summer where many of much of the art that I was making was based out of the trauma of what was going on, even though I'm aware that there's this commodification of Black trauma, but also that being how I was feeling at that period of time, right? And so how do you kind of balance all of those elements?
I think of 7 last words of the unarmed as a sort of asymptote. You know, in math, that sort of line where the curve approaches infinity, but never actually, you know, never gets there. I feel that the vulnerability that I displayed in that composition, which was really only a product of the fact that I didn't expect an audience, is something that I am aiming towards every time I sit down with pencil and paper. I'm hoping to be as honest as possible because I've seen the effect that honesty and transparency and vulnerability can have. And I see that as one of the primary agents of change that I'm seeking. And so that transparency, that honesty is very difficult to come by, especially when, you know, clothed in the institution as I am right now, because in the back of your head you're aware, you're all of a sudden aware. That's why I don't think I will ever really be able to get back to the level of vulnerability that I had with 7 last words of the unarmed. That piece will forever stay there. But you know, just trying to be as honest as possible in the joys and the sorrows, and all the things in between. Yeah, I think that's all I can do right now.
Oh, that was beautifully said. Thank you. And in maybe a similar vein, but for Garrett, how has your approach changed over your career in the way that you think about creating this change?
Yeah, for me personally, simply put, I used to code switch and now I don't. You know, a part of the conditioning was for us to leave our blackness at the door when we entered certain spaces, when we entered classical music spaces. Now I just don't do that because I see a better future. I see a future in which we can all enter a space as ourselves with our own perspectives and with our own sensibilities and needs met musically. Um, that's been the biggest change over my career by far. Just understanding, you know, the depth of the classical training, what it means, how it's manifested in my everyday life, much less my musical life, and what I need to do to wash myself of that.
Beautifully said. Thank you. And I have one last question before we transition to the question and answer section from the audience. So I also want to encourage people who have been listening and thinking about things they want to say to go ahead and write those in the chat. My next question is for both of you. What do you hope current and future art activists, art administrators, anyone in the audience here today will take away from this talk?
I encourage everyone to think about the music that is foundational to your lived experience as an American, okay? If that music that is foundational to your lived experience centers a European tradition, I encourage you to ask yourself why and to go down that thought path and really understand the implications therein. If what is foundational to your musical lived experience, if it isn't rooted in something European, ask your local schools, your local orchestras, and your local institutions why they're actively leaving you out, why they're actively leaving the classical music of your culture out of their so-called classical music infrastructure.
For me, I would encourage all listening to remember that love is the solution to the problem that we're facing, you know, and I think trying to create spaces for that love is essential to the solution. And that love is difficult, that love is not easy, that love is a series of choices, that it's not going to be easy, but it's the solution. And I think if all of our decisions could be rooted in that fact, not just love of the music that we engage with, but of humanity, of each other, of ourselves. I think if we all had that aim, if that was priority number one, we could be the change that we seek. What that looks like in practical terms on a hierarchical institutional level, I don't know. But as an individual artist, that's the sort of wellspring of my hope. And I encourage others, art administrators, artists, to do the same.
I would love to just affirm what Joel just said about love. You know, when you love humanity, when you love your sister, when you love your brother, you don't consider their feelings over the so-called genius of a rapist in our field. You know, I feel like I have to bring that back up. When we love each other in that way, it will solve so many of the problems that we're dealing with. So I wanted to affirm what Joel said there because that is absolutely pivotal.
Thank you all so very much. It was amazing and just so well-worded answers. I am going to start with this question here, which says that the idea of the spiritual as American early music is powerful. However, I'm uncomfortable thinking of white people singing spirituals. Isn't there a risk that pushing this idea will morph into approved appropriation? Now, this is a question that I know that Dr. Louise Toppin at the University of Michigan teaches a class on African-American art song and spirituals. And there's a lot of heated debate as to the idea of, are some spirituals okay for white people to sing and some not? Maybe don't sing any that have lines about, you know, this, my personal skin being black, but you can sing Deep River, things like that. I would love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Joel?
Okay. This is complicated. But having written a piece that is rooted in present Black trauma, and may, you know, I don't possess the arrogance to call it this, but it has been described as sort of a modern spiritual, because it sort of functions in the same way in terms of talking about current Black grief. Having that piece premiered by a predominantly white institution, University of Michigan, but under the under the baton of a Black man, Dr. Eugene Rogers, and seeing the effect that that has had on the members of that ensemble in years since, and on the institution and the community for which it was performed as well, I think that there is room for all to engage with the art. The particularities of how that engagement exists, I think that is up to the communities and the members of the communities present. But I want to think of music as creating a space where we can see each other. And I think there are ways in which we can see each other while also checking our privilege and checking our power dynamic as we engage with it. That's where the line between appropriation and appreciation can get blurred. When we don't acknowledge power, when we don't acknowledge capitalism, like Garrett was hinting at earlier. It's so often that our grief gets commodified. I mean, even with Seven Last Words of the Unarmed, I'm seeing it. happen in real time. And so there's this legacy, this history that's baked into identity, baked into the narrative that informs who we are as Black Americans, that is wrapped up in the Negro spiritual. And so it's tricky, but I do think that there is space to engage with the art form. I'm really interested to see what Garrett says in response.
From my perspective, a true and equitable teaching of the Negro spiritual includes the pain, includes the anguish. And if those people teaching the spiritual teach all of that, the person who is not Black with the right heart will understand what it means to go and try to capitalize off of that Black pain and that Black struggle. But additionally, I think teaching of the Negro spiritual will teach an appreciation and an application of all American music. We wouldn't have Florence Price and William Grant Still if it weren't for the Negro spiritual. We wouldn't have Lauryn Hill or Nicki Minaj if it weren't for the Negro spiritual. Well, you know what? We also wouldn't have Charlie Pride and Dolly Parton and Garth Brooks and Maroon 5 and Ariana Grande and all of these people without the Negro spiritual. So I think what the bigger point is for me is to highlight how all of the music that you love right now is Black music.
Thank you, Garrett. You never disappoint. That was beautiful. Let's move to the next question. We're getting lots coming in. In typical American classical music training, there's been a big distinction between art music and popular music, or commercial music, if you will. How do you think about breaking down those barriers in education, particularly higher ed? What would be part of dismantling views of classical music as Eurocentric? Ironically, performing artists out in the world do this far more readily, and higher ed seems to be moving at a much slower pace. I don't know if you both can see that. It's listed and answered.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that the majority of schools of music in this country only specifically study one type of music. But the name of the institution is a school of music. But it really should be a school of music rooted in Western European concert traditions and legacy. I would like to see, as the questioner stated, there's less of this line between art and popular music. I feel like these lines were drawn according to race. I mean, Gershwin encountered the same sort of criticism, Bernstein as well. I think with just sort of what, I mean, I'm just gonna go ahead and say I'm in the, maybe I shouldn't say it. Well, no, I'm gonna go ahead and say it. I'm in the Met New Works program, and along with Jesse Montgomery and Valerie Coleman, whoever finishes first is going to be the first commissioned person by this body. I'm in no rush, but in our contract, I don't even know if I can say this. It's either between the Metropolitan Opera or Lincoln Center Theater, and depending on the canvas, I guess, on which you tell your story, it will be in one house or the other. And I think, without saying too much more, it's really according to these lines that are drawn in the question that the questioner has made apparent, made very clear, that classical music wants to preserve that line. And that line exists according to race and class. And I would like to see that line evaporate and us appreciate music as a whole. Yeah, I'm gonna get in trouble.
Well, you know what? As an entrepreneur, as an independent producer, I hope I can afford to see it. I hope somebody at the Met is asking that question. I hope I can buy a ticket to see this, because history proves that I cannot. Well, I can, but that's a lot of money to give to that institution.
No, thank you. And I think that was a Great response. I also think a lot about, as a current student, the way that requirements and repertoire requirements are set up and how limiting that is, and how, you simply have to learn a certain number of songs. And if you're not allowed to learn any of these ones you're interested in, you have to figure out a way to do that after school. So absolutely, it's a really important question. I'm going to go a little bit out of order, Garrett. I think you might be able to answer this one fairly quickly. Garrett, when you say that classical music is racist, do you refer to the actual music and composers or the institutions that present classical music?
Yeah, I'm talking about the entire infrastructure that allows these pieces to exist. So, for example, I was on a call with someone earlier today, and we were talking about Aaron Copland as one of the good ones, one of the ones that we should maybe keep around. Well, through my extensive study and work, I'm able to pull out, Aaron Copland's misogyny. Is that to say that we need to burn his music to the ground and never listen to it again? No. What it's saying is that there are certain infrastructures that allowed folks like him to be in those positions, and those infrastructures were not open to women and to people of color, at least for the first cajillion years of Western classical music. So when I talk about classical music being something that's racist, I'm talking about classical music's infrastructure as one that centers white men. And quite frankly, if you need me to cite a source, just pull up any orchestra's programming from last season. Go to your classical music radio station and see what their playlist looks like. There is the evidence. What are we going to do about it? That question is what I answer in my work.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Antonio Kyler. So glad to see you're here, Dr. Kyler. Dr. Kyler asks, what might Black Americans' artistic and creative expression look like without marginalization, oppression, and subjugation? Beautiful question.
I would start crying if I think about that. I'm just gonna sit this. I mean, it's a dream. The quote that's been going around recently from Toni Morrison about how racism is really just a distraction from living, from simply existing. Can you imagine? I mean, if Black creativity is what it is in the context of that, perennial distraction, can you imagine what we would create without that distraction? And like, a distraction is just like a light way of putting it. But I think what Toni Morrison is hinting at is the amount of space it takes up in the brain, the amount of space it takes up in one's emotional tank. So imagining the creative possibilities, if my tank wasn't occupied with whether or not the bus drove past me today on the way to my COVID test, was it because that person thought that I wasn't waiting for the Yale shuttle? I would have more room to be thinking about my Baldwin symphony, but now, yeah, I like that question. It's really inspiring. It makes me dream. It makes me more committed to doing the work to change this whole thing. Yeah.
From my perspective, one of the answers to that question lies in our music. I've been spending a lot of time with Florence Price's single movement piano concerto. It's just one of those pieces that I love to return to. It's one movement, but three major sections. The first section is filled with all of this anguish and heartache and just, a reminder of the past. The middle movement is just this really tender, it almost sounds like a love song, just, dipping into, that essence of community and family and love, as Joel was speaking to earlier. And then that final section, as is represented in many of Florence Price's compositions, is the Juba dance. This movement that just shows us Black folks having fun. The so-called classical music's version of a cookout, if you will. I think a post struggle art for Black folks will sound like that.
But here's the thing, though. Here's what I'm thinking about with that is that the reason the context for our joy is still framed by the struggle that it comes after, and the sad thing about that question is that, are we ever going to be able to escape that part? The joy is that much more rich because of what precedes it. But yeah, I feel what you're saying.
No, absolutely. Again, I'll speak to the Black canon again. William Grant Still's Second Symphony is subtitled "Song of a New Race." So what he's talking about in that piece of music is Afro-Americans, Black Americans, as a newly created race of people based on those things of the past. I agree that the we fight this battle so hard because we understand that that victory will be all the more richer, as Joel said, when we finally get there. It's one thing to be in the light. It's another thing to be in the light, really and truly understanding what darkness is. And I feel like Black people and people of color in this country have a real understanding of that. I started out by acknowledging the women whose lives were lost down in Atlanta. When we talk about what America is, we're talking about an infrastructure built on that hate. So of course, any person of color who comes here, is going to be a victim to that hate because it's built into the very system. So when we can finally, break free, that means that we have broken down a number of systems. The liberation of Black people, at least in the context of America, is the liberation of women because it's a patriarchal system we're dealing with. It is the liberation of the queer community, of people of different abilities. We can go down the list because we're talking about that core issue, that original sin. So when we dismantle that, I believe all will be dismantled.
Amazing. I'm going to try. I think we might have maybe 2 more questions, maybe 3. We'll see what we can get through. The next question we have is, what advice would you give to white allies who work in institutions that are hesitant to change? How can we be helpful beyond amplifying and centering BIPOC identities? Thank you for your emotional labor and insight today.
First and foremost, I appreciate allies. Accomplices are far more useful to me and to the cause. I think we really have to dig into the differences between those things being a passive supporter and an active supporter. So since the question was to allies, to passive supporters, I would say that my advice is to understand the ways in which you are complicit in a racist system. If that's something that you do not have the tools to overcome, if you don't have the $1 million sitting in your checking account to just quit your job or whatever, figure out ways in which you can enact change in other places. We are all victims of that capitalism, as we've been saying. So I don't mean to say that every white ally working in every white-led institution has to put down the plow and quit their job. What I am saying is that when you really sit down with the truth of the matter, that you are part of the problem, it's a bigger impetus in figuring out ways in which you can practice equity, even if it can't be at your very workplace. Step 1 is understanding that you are part of the problem and swallowing that hard pill.
I think from my perspective, there are a lot of just thought processes, thought mechanisms that are a part of the system. Speaking as a man in a patriarchy, we are socialized to think of our masculinity as a specific way, and those, regardless of the positive influences in your life or however many bell hooks books you've read, the process is still ongoing and changing the neurons, the thought processes and mechanisms that are in your head and how you think about these things. And those processes are present in these institutions that we're fighting against. So I would encourage the questioner, just like Garrett said, to look within yourself and see if you can change the pipes and direct them to different ways, but also recognize that within those institutions, those pipes need to change as well. It's easier said than done, though. All power to you.
Next question, can you talk about the need or not for independence in relation to taking action for disruption?
I wonder if they mean professional independence or I'm not quite sure. I mean, I can answer to the best I understand. Um, independence has been a benefit for me. Not that I will never work with or collaborate with an institution in a professional capacity again, but I think there is power in having that freedom to say certain things. Joelle, you mentioned James Baldwin. A few weeks ago, I spent some time presenting and speaking on a conversation between James Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni on a television program called Soul from 1971. One of the things that Nikki Giovanni said that I found so striking from her perspective, and again, this is 1971, from her perspective, what her generation brought to the table was the freedom for the independence for Black people to say, hey, I don't like white people. Okay. Not that that means Nikki Giovanni does not like all white people, as much as that means it takes a independent mind, a freed mind, to be able to name an issue. We talk about naming issues all the time. When it comes, I'll offer the example of sexual assault. It is not always safe. It is more often than not safe for a woman to speak that truth. So there is power in that independence to be able to speak that truth. Now, with all of that being said, nothing was ever done by one woman or one man alone. Having a team, having your people is so important. So I couldn't do the work that I do without my accomplices. I definitely have to name that. Independence of thought, independence of resources is certainly important, but having a team is so much more important. What would the Million Man March have looked like if only Martin Luther King Jr. had showed up?
I think independence could be, you could substitute power for independence. I think when we're talking about teams and groups, it's we might have small power on our own, but when we're combined with other people, it, you get what I'm trying to say. But that independence, though, usually it requires a lot of resources, money being sort of like the capital of power, I guess, in order to enact this change. So yeah, there's lots wrapped up in there. I agree with what Garrett said.
Now, the pickle is, when it comes to combining our powers, I found that, and this is no fault of anyone's, but I have found that many people underestimate what their power as an individual is, or the impact that they could actually have. I think we always have to, push ourselves to do more and to do more and to do more. I haven't clocked into a job in over 6 months, and I'm busier than I ever have been. I get up every morning because I'm pushing myself to always do more. So in whatever corners we are, whether it's a musician in an orchestra, an arts administrator, a teacher, somebody who is outside of the classical music infrastructure altogether. I think if we push ourselves, have that independence of thought to push ourselves to really see how much we can actually do, we'll get all that much more closer.
This next question, I'm going to try to combine two questions into one because they both seem to be focused on early and elementary education and musical studies. Are you hopeful that if teachers took a more holistic approach to teaching in early/elementary education, students will grow up more empathetic and thusly also take a more activist approach in the arts? What role do you think exists with dealing with those current issues with children and youth? And then in a slightly related note, do you have recommendations for classical pieces by Black composers that you think would be appropriate for elementary school students and young musicians?
Well, to the second question, I think it's completely appropriate to teach, an elementary school class something like Wade in the Water. I think that might have been, one of the first times I was exposed to a Negro spiritual outside of church or outside my parents. So, the catalog for elementary school education is there. To the first question, I'm thinking about Again, one of the biggest privileges is, in producing my work is getting to interview and talk with so many people. So you mentioned Louise Toppin earlier. She's going to be on my show in a couple weeks. I'm excited about that. But several months back, I think back in August, I talked with a music educator down in the Nashville area named Franklin Willis. I encourage everyone to look up the name Franklin Willis. One of the points he makes, one of the stories he tells is that you have to teach a child, when we talk about elementary school teaching, steady beat is one of the first things that you have to, a concept that you really dig into someone's mind. He does it with hip hop because hip hop has a steady beat to it. So, it's not about teaching the children hip hop, it's about teaching them the concepts you want to teach them through a lens that they can engage and through a lens that they can understand. And quite frankly, the white kids who listen to pop and country at home love it as well because it is actually an engaging lesson and an engaging approach. Um, I mean that's my take on that. The story that I tell people oftentimes when I'm talking about myself is that my experience trying to teach middle schoolers is what pushed me off into the performance wing and then later on into broadcast. But I loved every second of teaching elementary school students because it is such an important time and it opens the door up to so much creativity. When you think about a 7-year old, they are way more open to using their imagination in a way that we adults are not, certainly in those spaces. So I would, my other suggestion would be to really tap into that and take advantage of the fact that you're dealing with human beings who have a very broad imagination and are open to far more than we may think.
Yeah, I agree. I taught middle school for 2 years as well, along with some high school students, and I miss it. I love it. Maybe not the middle school part; those are for angels. High school I could do, but no, I remember having a conversation with my seventh grade about totally fine about it. I knew how to construct it. I collaborated with another teacher, made sure everything was age appropriate. They are talking about it themselves, so I might as well create a space in which it's okay to talk about it. It was at the least diverse private school in Atlanta, so a lot of them opened up about seeing people that they have respected and admired in their community be racist, and they had to contend with that. And we had to talk about feelings and respect and humanity and consent and all of that at a very appropriate seventh grade level. And I did it like co-teaching with my fellow teacher, I guess. So yeah, there's ways in which we can talk about these issues with youth. They're ready to talk about it because it's everywhere.
There are 8-year-olds making six-figure salaries on TikTok and YouTube in the year 2021. Of course, they're ready for these conversations.
Thank you so much for that, Garrett. You're right. Gen Z they know what's going on. We are about 10 minutes from the end, so I just want to make a quick note that momentarily you should see a feedback poll which will pop up on your screen. Please, please, please fill that out for us. Again, it'll take less than 30 seconds. And then just to highlight that our next Disruption, Action, and Change session is Thursday, March 25th from 4:30 to 6 through the same link that you used to get here. If you haven't registered, register or share it with friends. And please read Joelle and Garrett's blog posts, which again, you can find at the link in the chat. You can read a bit more about each of them and get a little more context for what they discussed today. Okay. Our last audience question, there is the poll, is what do you think about writing a statement for the arts similar to the land acknowledgement statements that we're currently using? What would you say? I'm thinking that this is a statement for the arts about marginalized representation or Black artistic experiences. Or are you saying, maybe I'm not understanding that question correctly, actually. Maybe they're saying a statement for the arts about. I'm going to let you all interpret that how you feel. I'm not sure.
I think we've gotten a lot of statements, certainly since last June. So what I'm more interested in is action. As an example, one of the schools that I've worked with is the University of California, Long Beach. They have, in their words, decolonized their music history curriculum. So those students will learn things that we did not learn when we were in school. There are people in those positions doing things. So that's what I'm more interested in. I think we can all, if Black people can take on the labor of figuring out how to traverse the world and survive and do all of this under these racist systems, I don't think it's too much to ask everyone to do the labor of figuring out the action that needs to be done or that can be done as a step in the right direction and not just a statement. We've had lots of statements.
Yeah, I second that idea about statements. Many times these statements are done in the spirit of absolution rather than actually working towards a solution. And so I agree with Garrett, more action, less words. But also, I also want to recognize that for a lot of people and also institutions, that there's this fear of messing up. I think just know that you're going to mess up. There's this as musicians, we know the cloud of perfection cultism that sort of pervades classical training, and that many times can lead to a sense of paralysis. I think one of my favorite thinkers nowadays, a contemporary theologian / artist, Black queer, Ashawn Crawley. I don't know if anyone knows. He was posting something about Kirk Franklin, the whole Kirk Franklin saga, but he said something about it's a testament to one's character. What do you do when you have harmed someone? What do you do when you have been harmed? Those are the questions I'm more interested in asking as an artist, as an individual, and also what I hope institutions would be asking themselves. What do we do when we have harmed? You're going to mess up. A statement's not going to put a Band-Aid on it. What are you going to do for people that you have harmed? Yeah.
I've had when on the topic specifically of feminism and womanism, I've had a lot of women get me together, and that's something that I'm prepared for when I enter those spaces. I think white people need to understand that being got together is not being dismissed. It's about the work, and that is a part of it for all of us.
I read an article the other day that being got together is sort of like a Black phenomenon, that we're like okay with like messing up and like being corrected lovingly by our community. But there's so much indirection, like not being direct in the predominant white culture, that many times is a stumbling block for any progress. In order for any progress to be made, we have to be truthful and honest and direct with each other about what we feel.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It makes me immediately think of my mother always telling me that, someone's reading her for filth, and this whole concept of, hold us accountable, please. And just in closing, I want to thank you both so much for being here. And I think something that's really been clear to me in hearing all of the incredible things you've been saying is how much this work has to happen internally first before we're able to really have it happen in institutions and in larger organizations. And so I just wondered, as a send off question, if there is a book or a podcast or an article that you've read that has really altered the way that you think about these issues or has been substantial in your own thinking on how to diversify classical music or your own personal work in this way.
My biggest inspiration is the rapper Joe Budden. Everything he's done, his trajectory from coming up as an artist and dealing with that, and then transitioning into the world of media and really being a loudspeaker. I think most specifically about ownership of content, but many other things, including race. I go to him. I know that is I know that that can't be everyone's cup of tea because he comes from he represents a perspective that is very different. But when people ask me what I'm reading or that sort of thing, I just he's my biggest inspiration. Twice a week, I get a master class from him thanks to his podcast.
I am reading two books right now. The Will to Change, Bell Hooks, and also Begin Again by Eddie Glaude Jr., the Baldwin Scholar at Princeton, because I'm working on a piece for orchestra and narrator using Baldwin's texts. Baldwin has been just like a guiding light for me in the last year or so. Yeah, and so I would say read all the Baldwin you can, read Begin Again, read The Will to Change. I think for me, The Will to Change by Bell Hooks calling out the sort of imperialist, capitalistic, heteronormative patriarchy, looking at it's not a perfect analogy or can't be mapped perfectly in one onto the other, but looking at things as a man in a patriarchy and then thinking about solution to the race, white, black sort of dichotomy, just learning how to think about each other, how to think about solutions together. It's really been helpful. So for Baldwin and Baldwin's.
I'd love to share my favorite Baldwin quote since you brought him up. You know, a lot of my media research and doing that is going back to those. You know, like I mentioned the conversation between Baldwin and Nikki Giovanni. You know, that's a big part of my work as well. I'll make my final statement. This quote from James Baldwin. I don't know whether the labor union and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter. But I know I'm not in their union. I don't know whether the real estate lobby has anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobby is keeping me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen. If we can't connect that statement to the classical music infrastructure, what can? We're being asked to make these acts of faith in structures that we have never historically existed in. So, huge shout out to then Jimmy Baldwin, as we remember him, James Baldwin. I will second that. Everyone go read some Baldwin.
Can I have another Baldwin quote since we're doing this? So this is hopefully the one that ends my piece. But we are living in a world in which everybody and everything is interdependent. It is not white, this world. It's not black either. The future of this world depends on everyone in this room. And that future depends on to what extent and by what means we liberate ourselves from a vocabulary which now cannot bear the weight of reality. He's a prophet. He's a prophet.
Well, I just need to thank both of you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so much, Garrett and Joelle, for joining us today. Thank you all of you viewers who I cannot see, but I trust are there, for being here. This has just been soul-filling for me, and I'm sure for everyone else. So thank you so much for your time. To all of our viewers, if you haven't gotten to check out our guest blog post yet, definitely head over to the link in the chat. We hope to see you at our next session, Thursday, March 25th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we'll be talking to Dr. Antonio Kyler about disrupting performance practice traditions. His blog post will be available starting this Monday, March 22nd, at the same link that you'll currently find Garrett and Joelle's. Thank you so much for being here and have a great evening, everyone.